So until ES 2025, sets only had the four methods that we just learned about: has, add, delete, and clear. So sets weren't really that useful, and actually I never really used them personally for anything. But now that's changing, because in ES 2025, sets got 7 more methods, which makes them a lot more useful, especially when used together with arrays. Also, these new methods bring sets more on par with sets in other programming languages, where they're actually an important data structure. So let's briefly now look at some of these new methods in this lecture. Now for the demo in this video, we're actually going to use 2 data structures that were present in your starter code. So we can find them up here. So these Italian foods and the Mexican foods. So just go to your starter files and grab them from there. And maybe if they were not there yet, you can just download the starter files again, or as an alternative, you can also just copy these few lines here by hand. So I'm just gonna grab them and paste them here, because these are the sets on which we'll now experiment with these new methods. So these new set operations. So first off, let's say that we have an application that contains these foods, so some Italian foods and some Mexican foods, and then in that application, we needed to find out which ingredients are present in both of the Italian and the Mexican cuisine. So just by looking at this here, basically by just reading the code, we see that tomatoes, for example, is present here and here. So both in Italy and in Mexico, tomatoes are part of the common cuisine. And the same is true, for example, here for garlic. So this is how we could see it manually, basically. But of course, we want a programmatic way of finding these common elements into sets, or maybe into arrays. And so let's now use the first new method, which is the intersection method. So let's create a new variable here called common foods. And then let's use the Italian foods. And on this one, we call the intersection method. And then in here, we pass the other set. So that's Mexican foods in this case. So basically what this will do is to find, again, the intersection between this set and this set. And we could also have specified them here in the other order. So we could have called Mexican foods.intersection and then pass in the Italian foods. So the order here really doesn't matter. So the result of the intersection method is a new set which will contain only the elements that are present in both of the sets. So again, that's going to be here tomatoes, garlic, and maybe some other ones. So let's see what we got. So console.log, and then I will again log 2 things here. So intersection, basically using this here as a label so that later we know what is what actually in our output. And then here are common foods. And so, beautiful. Here is that set with the tomatoes and the garlic. So exactly the 2 ingredients that we had already identified. Now, what if we wanted an array of this? Well, that's pretty easy as well, because we already learned about the spread operator. So we can just create a brand new array like this, and then we spread all of the elements of the set like this into that new array. And so then we get exactly that. So an array of tomatoes and garlic. So in fact, this is extremely useful when working with arrays, which is a way more common data structure than sets. So many times in our applications, we are working with arrays, not with sets. But as you already know, we can easily convert arrays to sets and sets to arrays. So finding the elements that are common in 2 arrays is actually a pretty common task. And so before these new set operations were added to the language, we had to build our custom solutions with something like a filter method or something like that. But now we can simply use the intersection method like this. All we would have to do if we had some arrays would be to convert them to a new set like we have here. So this is actually exactly what I'm just talking about. So these are arrays and they have been converted to a set just by calling new set like this. So just as we learned also, or as we did in the previous lecture down here, right? So pretty useful. And the same is true for our next method, which is the union method. So this one will give us all the elements that are present in either of the sets. Or in other words, all the elements of both sets, but without any duplicates, of course. So let's create a new variable here, Italian and Mexican, and let's call this one fusion, because basically that's exactly what this one here does. It will just basically combine everything into one set, but again without any duplicates. So here we can again do Italian foods dot union and then pass in the Mexican foods, but it could also be the other way around. Just one thing that I didn't mention earlier is that you need a pretty up-to-date browser for this to work, because these new methods here, as I mentioned earlier, are part of ES 2025. So at the time I'm recording this, only the latest versions of browsers will actually support this method here. All right, and so let's log this to the console as always. This time we have a union and then Italian Mexican fusion. And indeed, now we get everything here. But of course, tomatoes is only present once, and also garlic, because remember how sets are unique. So all the elements in there must be unique. Now in this case, there would actually be another way of achieving this. And maybe you want to try this as a challenge, but you also don't have to. So if all we want to do is to combine two arrays and then get their unique values, which basically is what this is, so that's what the union does, we can do it in another way. We can just create a brand new array and then spread both of these arrays in there. So as we also already learned a bit earlier. So the Italian foods and then the Mexican foods also spread out like this. And I will just log it to the console here, just to show you that this isn't perfect yet. Because indeed, now we have the duplicates. So remember how tomatoes and garlic are present in both the cuisines. And so now it's here, and here is tomatoes and garlic again. And so if we wanted the same result as before, we would have to actually create a set out of this. So a new set, and there we go. So now these are exactly the same as here. And if we wanted an array out of this, so basically converting it back to an array, we could just do what we did up here. So basically creating a new array and then spreading the result. So this is starting to look a little bit confusing, but it's going to work just fine. So now it has 10 elements, this array here, just like the set earlier. And we could then create a nice function for this if we needed to do this operation over and over again, instead of always having to type this code. All right. So this method is not the most useful one, but the next one is again a bit more useful, which is the difference method. So the difference method gives us a new set which will contain all the elements that are present in the first set, but not in the second one. So basically this gives us all the elements that are unique in the first set. And so here now the order in which we specify the sets here and here will actually matter. So let's do unique Italian foods. And so here, Italian foods dot difference, and then the Mexican foods. So console dot log difference Italian, and then here the unique Italian foods. And let's see, that's the pasta, gnocchi, olive oil, and basil. So it makes sense that these are basically all the ingredients, all these 6, except for the ones that are common, as we already saw. So those are tomatoes and garlic. And so, therefore, those are the ones that do not appear in the Italian foods here after the difference operation. So basically this removes the elements that are common from this Italian foods set. And by the way, if you know anything about mathematics, all these operations also exist in mathematical sets. So maybe you have already worked with these, maybe in high school or something like that. And so then maybe all this is already a bit more familiar to you. So in any case, we can now do the same, but with the Mexican foods, because this time this will give us a different result. So as I mentioned earlier, now the order in which we use the sets here actually matters. So unique Mexican foods, we can do Mexican foods dot difference, and then the Italian foods. And as you can imagine, this will then once again give us all of the Mexican foods or ingredients, except for tomato and garlic. So difference Mexican unique Mexican foods, and indeed here are the other 4 which are not tomato and garlic. So as I just mentioned a minute before, all of these operations are actually mathematical operations that exist in sets in mathematics. So we can also see this in some nice Venn diagrams. And so let's actually search for this here in the documentation. So MDN sets, and then let's say the difference we just worked with. And so this is the one here. And so here we have this nice diagram. So imagine that these are all the Mexican foods and this one are all the Italian foods. These ones are the ones that are common. So this is the intersection. And so that means that tomatoes and garlic are right here. Then we have the union, which is all of this together, everything here. And then we have the difference, which in this case is only this. So all the foods that are only in the Mexican, but not in the Italian. So just like this. All right. And now next up, we have a pretty similar method, which is called the symmetric difference. And this one will give us all the elements that are present in either set, but not in both. So basically, this is the opposite of the intersection method. And if we think back to that Venn diagram that unfortunately I just closed, this will basically give us the part that is in the left circle plus the one that's in the right circle, but not intersecting. So it will give us the unique Italian foods plus the unique Mexican foods. So this is all starting to sound a bit abstract here, I guess, but there really is a use case in some situations and in some applications for these operations. And that's why they were added to the language. So just to show you, let's call this one unique Italian and Mexican foods. And then here, once again, the order doesn't really matter. So we can just say Italian foods dot symmetric difference. And these methods are so new that they are not even in the autocomplete in VS Code yet. But we can just type it out by hand. And so now log this one as well. So it's this huge one here. And so this should give us exactly these 8. So these 4s right here, plus these 4 of Mexico. All right. Now there are 3 more methods, but I'm not going to go really deep into these. So the 3 methods that we still have to look at are some methods that can be used to check whether one of the sets contains the other set. So these are called is subset of, is superset of, and is disjoint from. Now there is no need to waste too much time on all of these methods here, and so let's just use one of them, which we can use to check whether one set is completely different from another set. So this one is called the is disjoint from. So let's just do console.log without creating any variable. So Italian foods dot is disjoint from, and then Mexican foods. So again, this will check whether these sets are completely different. Or in other words, if one set does not contain any elements of the other set. And so in this case, they would be disjointed. Now, in this case, we already know that they have some elements in common, and so therefore we get false right here. But this is another nice method that we could nicely use with some arrays, and then in conjunction with, for example, an if statement or a ternary, or some situation where we need a Boolean value. And if you want, you can always go check out the documentation for is subset of or is superset of, which also will give us some Boolean value. But for now, let's wrap it up here and move on to our next data structure, which are maps.